Welcome to Canada Bangladesh Social Justice Action Research Alliance. On this platform, we talk about things that impact social justice locally and globally. Today, we have with us Dr. Maryyum Mehmood. Dr. Maryyum Mehmood is an established sociocultural analyst, cultural commentator, and community cohesion expert. Dr. Maryyum Mehmood is a young religious leader for the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations. Dr. Maryyum is the teaching fellow in religion and politics at the University of Birmingham, research associate at the University of Oxford. Dr. Maryyum is also teaching fellow in politics and international relations, SOAS University of London. I must say at the very beginning, Dr. Mehmood, your academic training is both impressive and very intimidating. So however, today we are hoping that if you could engage in a conversation in a rather very plain and simple language, so that anybody without having extensive academic training can actually understand, what is it that we are talking about. So if you just want to, I'm just checking. I just want to make sure that I have shared all the link everywhere. Give me one quick second. Okay. Thank you. Dr. Mehmood, welcome and Eid Mubarak.
Salam and Khair Mubarak. Thank you so much for having me on here. It's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you. The first question that we have always, that when we write social science researchers, we ask, your positionality. So my first question to you is that your present political consciousness, the place where you operate from, please tell us about your journey, from your experiences and how did you come to be where you are right now?
Great. So I think this question requires a very multi-layered answer. So, it inquires about the different aspects of my identity, which is something that I ended up studying, and the lived experiences that have shaped and continue to shape who I am. Much like many of your listeners, I happen to belong to South Asian heritage. So my ethnic background is Pakistani. And social justice runs deep within our veins as South Asian people, the experiences that our elders have had. And whether we choose to act upon it or not, it's latent, it's very much there. And I happen to be one of those people who has chosen to pursue this very actively and express it. So once we decide, I think, to take on this mantle, it changes our worldview and our position in the world. So situationally speaking, during my A-levels, I was at a crossroads. I could go down a very conventional, hard science STEM route that many of my family members are part of, but I chose not to. I became the black sheep, right? I chose to study social sciences because I felt, being a child of the 9/11 generation and then coming of age, post 7/7, these incidences really shaped drastically. They impacted many millennials, much like myself. So I'm not alone in, what forced me to really interrogate my own identity, to question existentially, what am I about? What do I stand for? And for me, again, the third element, so it's not just my ethnic heritage, it's not just the intersections of, the situational context that I found myself in, my faith. So I happen to be a practicing Muslim woman, and for me, I've been quite spiritual by nature since childhood. So, this question of when did you come into sort of this conscious reality of the social, political, situational context that you find yourself in. And personally, I think since birth, it's just something that, we see in our families, in our homes. It's not just political in the sense of elections or governmental issues, but the politics of the home. We're very much in tune with that. I feel even as South Asian people, we talk about the patriarchy, but matriarchal societies are what we are part of in comparison to sort of the Middle East, where patriarchal dominance, is very much prevalent. I find Persianate and South Asian communities are far more matriarchal if we question. So to answer your question, I think it's I didn't. This wasn't a calculated effort on my part. I think, subhanAllah, like God plans and we navigate ourselves in accordance, and that's something I have tried to do, which ended up in me studying politics and then, of course, continuing on in further education. So I hope I've answered your question.
You have more than adequately answered the question, but your answer has, created, a few questions in my mind. Is I've been a teacher for a long time, and when you said that you finished your A-levels in UK, I used to teach A-levels economics for a long time. So this brought me in, and you mentioned something that 9/11. I am familiar with the work of filmmaker Dia. She talks about the forgotten Muslim children.
Yeah.
Could I ask you a question that when you grew up during that time, how she approaches that these young Muslim people, they want to be accepted by their community, by the people where they're living, but because of the historical and cultural reasons, they're not being accepted, they're rejected. But at the same time, going back home, again, there is a tension. Now, that's her, presentation, and obviously that's her film subject. What was your experience? Like, how did you experience it, like growing up in Britain?
Right. So I grew up in Ireland mainly, and then when I was 14 years old, my family moved to Cambridge, and I was, I was a preteen. I was, I think, about 10 years old when 9/11 happened. So obviously these things really did shape who I am. And as you mentioned, Dia Khan, I'm a huge fan of her work too. I think she does some amazing documentaries and, actual. I think one way of addressing these issues of identity and belonging are through the arts, are through this medium. And, I couldn't commend her enough. We need more people like that. So I don't think it's just about academics writing about these issues. But just to answer your question, I think it's almost, I find it very interesting when researchers like myself become the researched. So when we ourselves are positioned in this way, to question our own experiences. And I think partly why I'm so interested in the realities of people like me is because it's a great avenue into understanding my own experiences and that of those close to me. So I think, yes, I do feel there is this this sort of divide almost, and this quest for belonging and identity, and many people feel it in different ways. Obviously we have, as I expressed, there are different layers, different intersections to even my own identity. So I'm a Muslim, I'm a woman, I am British Irish, I'm of Pakistani heritage, I have a certain level of education, socioeconomic state. All of these things make me who I am. And each person is an individual. They're very different in how they approach these issues. So I think, far more work needs to be done in portraying these schemas of identity, but they should be done in a very sensitive manner. I like the way that Dia and others like her approach this, because it's very much from within the communities. It's not imposed, because I think as somebody, as you've probably seen from my profile, I have done a PhD on racial and religious stigmatization. So not only do we have to counterbalance these internal issues that we have arising in our own midst, but we also have the securitization of identities, the Islamophobia, the racism that we see as challenges. So I think, as people have grown up, much like I did, during, this post-7/7 era, there are a whole flock of young people now, Generation Z, who we have to pave the way for. So it's not just about dwelling in that period of time. The world has moved on, and we need to acknowledge that. So I think the next step is really empowering, well, not empowering, I think they are empowered themselves, but assisting them, facilitating their empowerment is something we should be working towards, moving away from the stigma that was associated and affixed to Muslim identity, and really carving out what it means to be Muslim, done by those very people, by those young people born after 9/11.
Thank you. That was a very, insightful answer. And I think one of the things that you do, you reflect on this. I love your, spoken words. You're very eloquent, mashallah, and you're very, well informed as well. Could you tell us about, your how did you conceptualize, came to the idea of Shift with Maryyum and your current project, Safe Project? Could you tell us a bit more about it?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much for your kind words. So the SHIFT, for those who do not know, stands for Social Harmony, Intercultural and Faith Training. So that's what the acronym SHIFT is all about. Now, there's, I think perhaps no more of a coherent explanation than this for what I stand for. So sometimes, academics get asked, what do you do? All academia is it's just people sitting in ivory towers, regurgitating the same old semantic issues. What is Islamophobia? What is anti-Semitism? But really, there's much more to who we are as educationists, right? So I don't call myself an academic. Recently, I was speaking to a mentor of mine, and he said, Maryyum, you're a pracademic. You're a practical academic. So really, that's what you're about. So the SHIFT basically, if people would like to access the website or even the YouTube, it's The Shift with Maryyum. And there you can find out more about, how I engage with social harmony or intercultural experiences. So whether it's my podcast called Diasporistan, where we amplify voices from in and amongst the diaspora, or faith. Faith is a huge part of what I do. So for my day job, I lecture at a university. I lecture in a theology department, hence the faith. I do a lot of interfaith work. I train faith leaders. So that's where the training comes in. So basically, for me, my mantra is that academia and knowledge is no use if there is no exchange of that knowledge, or there is no impact or output from it, So I think that's what led to the establishment of SHIFT. And as you rightly said, I do write some spoken word. I'll be really honest, prior to the summer 2020, I had never written a poem. I had never really expressed myself through this medium. And I'll tell you, it is because my mother is, she, as I said earlier, like the rest of my family, she's a doctor, but she's not practicing at the moment. She was a Urdu poet in her free time. So she would write poetry, she would recite it. But I always thought, this isn't something that I would do. Because often, when you're growing up and you're a teenager and you're trying to express yourself, you think, well, that's something that my mother did. And, I don't have to be like her. I don't need to live in that shadow. It was only in my 20s and later in life that I really began to appreciate, this art form. And it was through my mother I realized, what? I have the ability to. Before I used to think, I don't. So I think that's something that's really important to me. Just to answer your question about SAVE. So SAVE stands for Spiritual Abuse and Violence Eradication Project. And that is the first of, inshallah, many projects that will be run under the SHIFT platform. So the SHIFT right now, I'm establishing it as a charitable company. Inshallah, we'll have that status over the summer. So everything, within the year we want to progress. Right now, it's just a one-woman show. Inshallah, in the future, there'll be more people who will join the SHIFT. So we see it growing. So we can talk about spiritual abuse if you like soon, but I just thought I would mention that is what SAVE is about. And the reason why I established that as the first project is because I myself am a survivor. This is something that I haven't told anyone publicly before, that this is something very, very important to me, not only because I'm a professional in this capacity, not because I do interfaith work, but because someone as independent, educated, and as religious as me can also be affected. So I have a duty to stand up for those women and young men and even older people who do not feel comfortable vocalizing that they have been affected by it. And, since I set up this project, I have been inundated with requests and people reaching out, such as survivors and those who work in the communities. So the purpose of this project at this stage is to raise awareness. And it's something that I'm doing also, with the UN as well. I'm raising awareness about spiritual abuse, also campaigning to eradicate it. So I can tell you much more about it, but I think for now I'll just leave you with that.
Thank you, Dr. Mehmood. You have I have never heard of spiritual violence. I was born in a Muslim family. My family is very practicing, and obviously, I'm familiar with many of the texts and things that we grow up reading. I've never heard of any spiritual violence. I have had a lot of questions about a lot of the edicts, but when it comes to belief, we do know we probably have to be courageous enough to recognize that we don't have a lot of space for dialogue. It is said to be belief, and hence no question can be asked. So, and what you have said wonderfully, and and it's I don't know if it's a coincidence. What you do is exactly what we do in our platform. I have been in academia for the past 20 years, and I know that how ivory tower remains ivory tower. And when I looked at your profile, surely, I was intimidated. You have been trained in King's College, you have a PhD, and your accomplishments are scary. But at the same time, I was wondering, can I have a conversation with you as human to ask questions, courageous questions? And that's where the academia can actually add a lot of value. So how do you define, for an average person like me, is that what is a spiritual abuse? I mean, we know about it as kind of jinn or something, but how do you define it?
Absolutely. Firstly, thank you, I guess, but also please, I don't want to come across as intimidating or, I think the purpose not only is social justice, but within our faith as well, it's humility. That no matter how educated someone becomes or how much prestige there is in their work, it's no use if there is this pompous attitude, right? That we need to really, because you know what, one person alone is not going to change the world. We need to work together. So I was really inspired by the work that you do at your organization. I think we have a lot to learn from one another and from all our friends in the coalition to eradicate these ills. So to answer your question directly, spiritual abuse occurs when those in positions of relative power distort or deliberately they misinterpret religious teachings or practices in order to coerce, control, or manipulate vulnerable believers into acting, behaving, or thinking in ways that are harmful to them. So, of course, that's a very loaded answer that I gave you, but we can unpack it. I just want to say that spiritual abuse, much like any other form of abuse, entails or is underpinned by this desire for control, for power, for dominance. So abusers will go in search of that. However, it is distinct because it entails the weaponization of faith, right? That is clearly, that's not to say that spiritual abuse happens on its own. It's, part and parcel of it. You will have, unfortunately, sexual abuse or other forms of financial abuse. They will take part and shape in how a spiritual abuser will express themselves.
So if I want to rephrase what I understood, so if I want to say is that it's using a particular edict or interpretation of religious edicts to advantage one group of people, but using the cloak that, well, this is part of your spirituality, this is part of your religion, and therefore you have to abide by it, even at the expense of their own well-being.
Yes, exactly. No questions asked. So, for example, I think one really good example is in cases of marriage, right? Where women are told that, you need to be subservient, you need to serve your husband. In some of our South Asian regional languages, this isn't just about the Muslim community, but they refer to the husband as majazi khuda, which means the God on earth. These sorts of things. In some, it is a term, and we have the same in Hinduism as well. But my point is that, we've diluted the faith so much with these cultural practices. And then I'm not saying that culture is to blame and religion is free. It is the fact remains that religion is then used to justify these actions and these ills. So it's very much intertwined. So we can't be reductionist and just blame culture for everything. But what is culture? It is a way of practicing, right? So yes, you're right. It is essentially that that people are doing things that will harm themselves. So women who are unfortunately, in these situations where they are victims of domestic violence, if they were to speak out, sometimes I have cases where imams will say to them that you should just go back home. You need to have sabr. You need to have patience, because this is a test from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that, I think, is not the right approach to take. Yes, we have tests in life, but endurance isn't the only solution. People need and require justice, and they should have it. And also therapy and counseling. There's all sorts of recommendations that could be given using the faith. But unfortunately, in order to prop up the patriarchal system, this is what happens. Women suffer more. Women aren't the only ones who are affected. Men are also affected by this, unfortunately. Even children. So in cases like where madrasa students are abused and corporal punishment is used against them, they're hit, they're brutally attacked. That isn't what our faith teaches us. But unfortunately, if those children speak out and say that they were, physically assaulted, or astaghfirullah, they were sexually abused, what happens is they're silenced, and they're told, in cases of physical abuse, you deserved it, and you should not be questioning your elders. You shouldn't be questioning this pious man. People will stand with the abusers many times because they think that this person has served the community on other occasions. So, so not only is spiritual abuse happening, it is being enabled doubly so, because you are being abused from the beginning using the weaponization of faith. But also when you choose to stand up as a survivor or an ally, you are again met with continued spiritual abuse. So I think that's another example. There are cases where toxic masculinity is also a massive issue within every community, but the ways in which it is justified are very unique depending on the context. So when we talk about faith-based communities, the roles designated according to gender oftentimes are imbued by toxic masculinity. So a man, a good Muslim man, according to spiritual abusers, will be someone who is hard, rough and ready, doesn't cry, doesn't express emotions, and is the dominant force, right? But that goes against the prophetic way. It goes against the Sunnah. For you to look and unpack the Sunnah, that is not what it's about. It is about cherishing humanity. It is about growth, personal as well as community development. So I find it really baffling when people, they forget all the kindness and empathy and compassion that all our faiths preach. And instead they focus on the ways in which they can enhance their own power.
Absolutely. I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and the questioners wish to remain anonymous for their social subjectivities. I'm sure they're familiar, with this sort of circumstances. And these questions are sensitive. These questions are challenging. But I think we need to ask those courageous questions. Some questions can be naive, and I think they're also important too. So one of the things in terms of Muslim spaces and Muslim culture, we will see that we sometimes can become very uncritical apologetic. A problem, that is a particular attitude, a practice that is very problematic. We'll try to defend it with everything that we can to justify the problematic practices. You mentioned just minutes ago the idea that what does it mean to be educated? Can we fight elitism, classism, that sort of attitude? So in your experience in growing up in a Western society, and also going, I don't know how often you visit Pakistan. If you do, how do you see in Muslim spaces, do you see that we can be uncritical apologetic that actually fosters problems like racism, misogyny, and but we somehow, and I'm sensitive to talk about it because Islamophobia is a real thing. You have a PhD on it, so I don't have to tell you, So how do we talk about it, talk about our problems, at the same time, in a way, not to marginalize a community who are already being marginalized, at least in Western context?
That's an excellent question. You're right. it's sadly all too common within our midst. Not only Islamophobia, which we can come and speak about in a moment, but you mentioned racism and misogyny. There are ways in which we can address these issues. We can talk about them in abstract terms. We can say racism is wrong across the board. Misogyny is also very much a social ill. But this is what I do when I train faith leaders in my day job. I contextualize things. Not only do I look at these issues from within those communities, but the solutions are also there. They're present within them. So we don't have to force. So the worst thing that has been done in policy terms is that, a marginalized or stigmatized community is further maligned and demonized when we approach those social ills and challenges, and in our attempts to contextualize them, we impose from the outside in. We impose ways of doing things, whereas that's all wrong. When we talk about issues that are prevalent within faith communities, and we acknowledge that this exists outside of those communities, then surely the way in which we go about it and the solution should be from the faith itself. So when it comes to racism, I have done a short video, I think about 15 minutes long, was one of the first videos that I uploaded to the shift. It was around the time when the Black Lives Matter campaign, the entire movement was gaining more traction. So as many of you know, this movement first developed way back 6-7 years ago. It became prominent first. And then, this summer, not just because of George Floyd's murder at the hands of authorities and police who committed that racist murder. It wasn't just one person, because I think in mainstream media, they just kind of fixate, oh, this was the reason, this was the turning point. I think it's important to realize that many Black people, not just in America, but definitely because of carceral police violence and oppression, were killed. Many of them had intersectional identities. Some were Muslim, some were trans people. So we have to take this into consideration that, but what was common to all of them was that they were Black, right? So when we started having these conversations within Muslim communities, as you've rightly pointed out, Muslim communities in the West are often marginalized or demonized after 9/11. And we live in fear of securitization. I understand that. But when we talk about Black Lives Matter, we can't do it by dissociating what happens within our midst. So we have to also understand that in amongst our Muslim communities, there is this racial hierarchy. There is this, we've created it, we've established it, that, some people, based on the color of their skin or their ethnic heritage, are more deserving of our sympathies and also of us championing their cause. So one of the first videos I put out was on racism in religion. And what I mean by that is not saying that religions are racist, but that people who claim to be Muslim, who claim to be religious, can also be racist. So how do we unpack that? How can we be allies, but also realize that it means more than just targeting state securitization, but actually ridding racism from within our communities? And I think what I found really useful was that I looked at leading Muslim figures from Islamic history, and not just pointing, we have this one token example that we keep giving, that, Hazrat Bilal was Black. That's what we always say. And that's just a way to silence any criticism. And that's really, really tragic, because we are suffering as a result. Not, because if our brothers and sisters in the faith who are Black, if they're suffering, then, we should, the onus is on us. We need to stand up, and we shouldn't be focusing on them to find the solutions for it, because that's just extra labor, emotional labor for the victims themselves. So I think a good way of thinking about this is when Islamophobia happens, we acknowledge it, right? And we expect allies to help us. So when racism happens, what should we expect? And when it happens in faith-based communities, what should we do? Obviously, the allies need to stand up, and I consider myself an ally. And also, not just an ally, I feel racism happens against South Asians as well, you know, in Muslim communities. So, and even amongst ourselves, we need to acknowledge elements of history. So as a Pakistani woman, when I put together my podcast, I must acknowledge that there have been incidences within history. So genocide in Bangladesh, right? These are things that we can no longer stay silent about, and we need to acknowledge them. That's not to suggest that somehow we need to be apologetic and that's the only thing that we do. We should acknowledge it because some of our ancestors were involved in this. So when we acknowledge it, then we rectify it, right? So these are the steps I think that people should take, not just about Islamophobia, not just about racism, but also of ethnic hatreds and communal violence, misogyny as well. Like, I mean, there is no shortage of work that I do against tackling violence against women. But I think I gave an extended example of racism because I feel the approach that I take with regards to that is similar across the board.
I mean, absolutely, and I love the way you actually approached it, and your candid, interpretation of our internalized hierarchy. And what's interesting that I find that at least in North American context, that I'm talking about Bengali Muslim men. When we were a British colony, the Bengali Muslim men, their first allies were Black and indigenous people in North America. There's a wonderful book, it's called Bengali Harlem, that documents that when these Bengali Muslim men came to Newark at that time and they jumped ship, they were criminalized by two most powerful empires. You have the British Empire and the American Empire. So how did they exist? How did they survive? They survived because the Black women, indigenous women, Puerto Rican women married those Black Bengali Muslim men. But if you see, and we don't want to talk about it, we don't want to talk about that, particularly in the context of colorism. And thank you very much that you brought the example of Bangladesh. Is even in 1971, the genocide that happened in Bangladesh, which was at that time East Pakistan, that was inherently also, a lot of it was motivated by racism. It's because the idea of West Pakistan's superiority, some kind of racial hierarchy because of whatever their ethnicity they are. Yeah. And it is also documented if we consult work like Yasmin Saikia. And it's interesting, we also have to recognize the fact many Pakistanis during 1971 stood up against it. Against the genocide. Yeah. So, yes, Pakistan has not yet recognized, their, crime against, as some of them have called crimes against humanity. And I appreciate you calling it genocide. It was a genocide. My parents, my families, are the survivors, and we have lost family members. My father is a freedom fighter, so I know it very well. But if you and I don't get into a dialogue, this politically produced and reproduced, socially supported, this hatred and animosity is not getting us anywhere. You're not my enemy just because you have some kind of ancestry. You have an ancestry in Pakistan. But thank you very much. Not everybody will be this upfront and honest in terms of having a conversation like the way you and I are having it.
Don't thank me for that, because this is the bare minimum. This is what we have to be doing, because acknowledgement is just the first step. I mean, people who, like my ancestors, I'll give you an example. My grandfather and his family moved from Indian Punjab to Pakistan Punjab. Right? So they have that in their own history. So for something to happen less than 25 years later, right, from 47 to 71.
Exactly.
Like, it just baffles me. It baffles my mind that this is happening. Similarly, if we were to talk about what's happening in Israel and Palestine, I'm working alongside Jewish friends, not just about dialogue. We want action. We want to work together so we can foster a more socially harmonious society, because, we're all mortal. We are going to pass away. We are going to, whether you believe in an afterlife or not, we aren't here forever. But the legacy that we leave will be impacting our generations, if there are going to be any generations after this, right? So we need to ensure, we really, really need to ensure that we don't just pat ourselves on the back and say, oh, look, look at me, I'm doing dialogue with my friends who are from a different faith or a different background. What we need to be doing is working on things. So once this conversation is done, I would, extend this hand to the Social Justice Action Research Alliance, that we work together in some capacity or another on any projects, because we matter. Our voices matter. The people who listen to us matter. And education is no use if we're just sitting here and just saying that, this is an issue, let's tackle it. No, we need solutions. And I genuinely believe for us that we can work together towards this.
Absolutely. And one of the evidence that, why this work is so critical, after, our conversation was published, by the way, a lot of the conversations, we work with one of the most marginalized communities in Bangladesh, and the language is Bangla. I have students, a lot of female students reached out to me, and they sent me this question saying, I can't ask this question in English. Can you translate this for me? And that touched me deeply. And I was thinking, this is important for being an educator. I mean, yes, we are speaking in English, but to be able to, you have a cultural capital. You can understand things in Urdu, and you can tell me that. I can understand things in Bangla, and I can tell you that. So the next question that I'm going to ask you, it's very sensitive. We don't want to address it, is child marriage. I have been an educator for the marginalized communities for a long time. And one of the biggest things that we struggle with is that when our young students, young girls, they're in the 7th and 8th grade, child marriage. What happens that a lot of the justifications comes from, our Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he was married to, Mother Aisha at such a young age. What is wrong in it? Now, it's scary, but I'm going to ask you, do you think we need revision to understand, the socio-economic, political, historical context of Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam? And can we continue to use this to support child marriage? How do we even think about it?
That's a great question. I really commend you for asking this question and for us having this space to speak about it. Now, as with any tradition, any set of practices or beliefs, they are open to manipulation and misinterpretation, right? My thought specifically on child marriage is that it is an abhorrent and unjust practice against those who are most vulnerable, right? Now, with regards to this specific example, we know that throughout history, Orientalists and Islamophobes have used this trope, have used this to malign Muslim men and women, right? Because they portray men as barbaric and our women as subdued and meek, which isn't true by any means, right? And this age gap is often called into question, the age gap, as you rightly said, between the Prophet, peace be upon him, and his wife, Bibi Aisha. Now, there is ample literature in the scholarship that refutes these claims. Some scholars, they find the age is contested, so they suggest that actually, in relation to Bibi Aisha's age and that of her sister, according to those documentation of that, her age at the time of marriage must have been 19. This is what some scholars say. Others contextualize the age gap in accordance with practices of the time. And they suggest, okay, relative to what was happening then, this was normal. But even saying that, something doesn't sit right. It doesn't sit right because we can't stomach this. Much like questions around slavery, we have to really have a nuanced understanding of what was the time then, how were they engaging in that, why that practice is, it's unlawful now. We see in what ISIS has been doing with young Yazidi women, with young Muslim women, with women across the board, really, and children. And that, because we haven't had a conversation, our scholars are so fixated, excuse me for saying this, but many scholars are too fixated on what a woman should do post-menstruation, or what, how her cleanliness should be, these sort of things that nobody is benefiting from, right? Women know how to keep their hygiene. They know what their rights and responsibilities are regarding their health. Why focus on that when you should be addressing these social issues? And instead of addressing them, you're permitting them. Now, I think what I find with all these endeavors is that they're counterproductive. Why do we try and infer these things from the age gaps, or this documents that we go through and we say, oh well, it's kind of ambiguous. We have such a concrete and clear guidance in the Quran, the Holy Quran itself, it categorically and clearly states that marriage requires autonomous consent, right? Choice is valued, not just in terms of marriage, but as, being individuals in this world. And the prophetic way is derived from the Quran itself. So instead of getting bogged down, surely it's very clear, there is no compulsion in faith. And faith is so beautiful because it is so simple. It can be. And it's, in our cultures, unfortunately, it is all too common, this child marriage, which I wouldn't call even child marriage. I would call it abuse, because marriage implies that there is choice, or there is, it is a bond, it is a contract. What can a child say or do? Because women, unfortunately, in our cultures, are still seen as financial burdens. And in other cases, they are married off for political reasons, to play as into these, feudal bartering, over land. Sometimes not only are they married to men, some young girls are married to the Quran, as if that is something that can be done. It is a practice across the subcontinent. Funnily enough, there was a point in my academic career where I thought I would do a PhD on that topic, on feudalism and women's rights. But obviously, I'm a young woman who does not have that backing in Pakistan. There's no way my parents would let me go there and do research. So I found something else. But anyway, I find that it is because of patriarchal and oppressive norms and structures that we have prevalent in our communities and our societies at large. They are the ones, those are the things that are setting us back. Because logically, if we were to sit and speak, so you and I are having this conversation, what is stopping the imams and those in higher figures of authority across Muslim nations or across Muslim spaces from addressing this issue in this manner? So we have legal frameworks. So in some parts of Pakistan, federal governments have said that the legal age of consent to marriage is going to be changed. But yet we have young girls who are still kidnapped and married off, not just Muslim girls, but Hindu minorities. Now that is really, really, it's devastating that we have to see this in our lifetime, and we feel so helpless, or sometimes we just don't think it matters because those girls aren't Muslim. So, there's much more to this issue. And I think what we need to be doing is looking towards prophetic guidance instead of trying to figure out the names and the dates and the ages of our beloved Ummat al-Mu'mineen. I don't think that's the appropriate way.
Absolutely. You touched on something incredibly important, and I think you often forget it, is brown Muslim women do not need saviors to rescue them from their distress. So you pointed out that very brilliantly. In terms of, this is something very important, and in the month of Ramadan, probably brings that example a lot, is that during women's menstrual cycle, I have seen, during the month of Ramadan, if my sister or my mother or any of the women in my family, they have menstruation during their time, they can't fast, and it's a taboo. They don't want to talk about it. They will drink or eat secretly and will have to hide, or they will fast later, that sort of thing. So I have like two questions here. What, and you have touched on, in your answer, both of them, is that in terms of violence against women, particularly in Bangladesh, and one of the main reasons, I was reaching out to you is to have a conversation, is that often when the violence against women are done, it is said, oh, it's because they're not modest. They have not covered properly. And this is used all too often, is that you are supposed to dress in a certain way. Mm-hmm. So I guess I want to address the question here is that, how do we want to understand that women's life, their bodies, their biologies are not a matter of shame? It should not be hushed, and how they cover their body should not be the reason to justify violence against them.
Thank you for bringing that to our attention. I think this is such an important thing to discuss. There was something that used to strike me a lot when I would visit Pakistan. So I haven't visited that often in my life, maybe a handful of times. And, on street corners and on TV shows before, in the UK, we have like a watershed hour. So before like an 8 p.m. you can't show certain things, right? But in Pakistan, I don't think that exists. There is moral outcry if there is an ad about sanitary pads or if those things are displayed in shop corners. However, and that is a necessity. That is something that women have no control over, right? Or people who menstruate. So it's not just women. We have trans folk who are, who might also be menstruating. So I don't want to stigmatize them by saying women, but what I mean by this is that in comparison to things that are necessities, if we look across the subcontinent, you have other objects, or what I'm trying to say is that they are readily available. So condoms are readily available. There are ads for what they call family planning, so readily on TV in front of young children. So that's okay. Showing killing and violence and bloodshed is okay as well. Forcefully, not just genocide. I mean, even on TV, it's perfectly acceptable. But we're not outraged by that at all. What we are outraged about is, women and not only what happens to them biologically, but also blaming them, shaming them, gaslighting them. And it is actually ridiculous. If you think about it, if you think about these oppressions, surely if you are level-headed, you should just wonder, like, why is this even happening? Why is this even necessary? Why should my sister suffer? Why should she be quiet? I am grateful that I come from a family where, most of my parents obviously, and my brother, so that's all I have. I have one sibling. They're all educated medically. So there's no taboo in our home. But I also know families of doctors who still do that. So it boggles my mind when those people who are actually educated in the medical profession are stigmatizing and considering this taboo, and also considering mental health a taboo. So, and people who are actually trained psychologists, psychotherapists, clinical psychologists, they themselves are engaging in this cultural malpractice. So what use is any of their education? Anyway, solutions to this, I think, require an overhaul. We need a complete shift in mindset. So this is why shift is so important to me, because it is about shifting, it's about challenging, it's about re-educating ourselves and unlearning these taboos, because it is not just about women acknowledging or knowing their rights and responsibilities, but equally, as I mentioned earlier, men are suffering. Toxic masculinity is killing men, right? And I'm not saying that to somehow consider that, to make excuses for abusers. I am not doing that at all. I'm saying that there are young men out there who deserve to be taught that it is not okay for them to feel the pressure of toxic masculinity, that they must act in a manly way. And what does that mean? If they don't put on this hard exterior, if they don't abuse other people, they're not a man. If they don't, if they don't put women in their place, if they don't serve or do the bidding of the patriarchy, somehow it makes them less of a man. So these are the ways in which we need to address this. It's not just about child marriage or enforced subjugation of women, but equally, there is a lot to be done to safeguard men.
How do you help us to think about that, when women's modesty is blamed and their covering is not sufficient, which is why they get raped, so they should cover adequately. And that's why a lot of the time, at least I'm going to be bluntly honest, is that in Muslim spaces, Muslim cultures, that this is why in our religion they're supposed to be covered in this way, because they are not covered in that way, which is why they're being victims of sexual abuse.
Yeah, I'll be very blunt with you there. The majority of cases of abuse of a sexual nature happen when the abuser is known to the victim. And in many cases, they happen to be related to the victim. Many victims are under the age of consent. They are children. They are young teenagers, right? And some cases, women are still abused when they are covered from head to toe with only their eyes showing. So saying to someone it is based on a piece of cloth is not the right way to address this. Because again, like you said, it's victim blaming and saying that, you know, if a woman is not covering, she's not modest. I think our whole language needs an overhaul, because in Urdu, the word for woman is aurat, right? And aurat derives from the Arabic and the Persian Farsi words. And what do they mean? It means an area of shame. It means something that must be covered up, right? So the aura and the aurat is the same thing. And I refuse to use those words, because it just reinforces these double standards. So that's why. And you know, when we say why is this happening in our society, why do we equate modesty, why do we moralize modesty, as one of my spoken words goes, it's because it is so entrenched in our culture, in our language, in our societies, and we need to address this. We need to acknowledge. So examples in ways people are doing this. So you may be familiar, and I hope that your listeners are familiar with the Aurat March in Pakistan that we have yearly on Women's Day. On 8th of March, we have women who take to the streets in different places across the country and even abroad. And they're the ones who are they're the bastions of change. They're forcing their families, because the change begins in the home. It begins when we address it not only with our youngsters, but also our elders. We need to be respectful. We need to be mindful of them, because we can't, like I said, if we do not have a coalition externally with other people from other faith groups and across society, and similarly internally, if we do not have that, then who are we speaking to? What is our cause, and who are we addressing, if not the people who are closest to us? So I think, you know, there's much to be done, but a lot of good work is being done at the moment. It's going on.
Absolutely. In Pakistani context, I'm sure you're familiar with the murder of Kandil Baluch, that, you know, when she was murdered by her own brother. And the fact was, when police was asking her brother that, why did you do that? The answer was, I was trying to protect the family from shame. Now, it's interesting, it's very heartbreaking, is if you look at, you know, particularly the violence. I will have a conversation, you know, with Dr. Shazia Rahman, in another, you know, very, you know, prominent scholar, and she writes a chapter in her book, is that the representation of 1971 in the literary work. We need to understand. So in a particular work of Yasmin Saiga, where there is one very powerful portrayal, is that a Pakistani soldier was raping a Bengali woman, and he was asking her, what are you? Are you a Bengali or are you a Muslim? And the woman was responding, I am both. But that both was something that you know, that was not, you know, he couldn't understand it. He couldn't understand it. So the fact is, you know, raping, impregnating, and shaming the not one, two, hundreds and thousands. In some documents, it says 300,000 women have been raped and, you know, impregnated. So it's very telling, is that if you look at any violence, look at Kashmir right now.
Yes.
Look at Myanmar right now, Uyghur right now in China. What's happening in Afghanistan right now? What's happening in Palestine right now? What's happening in Canada, where I'm from, with the indigenous people? There is a huge movement, and very something important that we need to understand is that missing and murdered indigenous women. Yeah. So the question is, the violence against women, raping women, and using these excuses that, well, you haven't covered yourself sufficiently, which is why you are a victim. Well, in 71, those women who were murdered, who were raped, they were Muslims too. Many of them are Muslims. So did their religion, protect it? No, it didn't protect it. So subsequent, and we need to have this conversation, because if we don't have this conversation, we'll not be able to overcome the intergenerational trauma. We will continue to hate each other, and our hate will be weaponized to benefit one group of people, and, you know, this indoctrination, just what happens between Pakistan and India. So, and in Canadian context, the entire lump together. Now, I'm going to ask a very challenging question, is that it is believed that the responsibility of a woman a married woman is to satisfy the sexual desire of her husband.
Mhm.
And when a woman is approached by her husband, if she does not, give her consent or agree to it, again, contested. I'm just saying what is believed. It's a naive question, and the question wants to remain, anonymous. Is why is it so hard for us to talk about marital rape in Muslim spaces? Why do we still do not challenge the notion that, it is a woman is, what is that, till a land to go and, till it, or like a garden, sorry, not like a space. I'm sorry, I'm
Okay.
yeah. I'm not able to articulate it properly. How do we talk about it? And how do you talk about it bluntly?
Mhm. Okay, so you've said some really important points. So you mentioned Khadil Bloch, you mentioned cases regarding the genocide, you talk about the global endemic violence against women, which is not something new. It is throughout history, right? So these are the clear points that you have made, and I wholeheartedly agree with you. So it is everywhere. It is prevalent, and it is up to us to demystify these misconceptions. So one of the examples that you have given is regarding marital rape and intimate partner violence, right? In the patriarchal cultures that many of us happen to belong from, or patriarchy has seeped in. If we were originally matriarchal, but because of some reasons we adhere to certain beliefs or ideologies that have become patriarchal over time, they suggest that it is okay to suppress women, to subjugate them, as well as I was saying earlier, impose standards of toxic masculinity on men in order for them to be more dominant, right? So as a result, we have certain interpretations of religious scriptures that use religion, as a veneer of credibility, a cloak of respectability, to reinforce these binaries so that women are never able to rise up, and men are constantly told they need to do X, Y, Z. They need to keep women down, right? Coupled with economic and political issues, whether it's, gendered Islamophobia, Muslim women globally are, especially the ones who are more observant in their attire, or they appear more observant rather, they are the most targeted because Islamophobia itself is gendered, right? So there are numerous challenges that these women are dealing with. So there's no one aspect to it that we need to address on its own. So I think a more measured response is actually victim-centered. So when we talk about these issues, we need to address them in unison. So you cannot have a approach or a campaign to end violence against Muslim women when you're simply talking about gendered Islamophobia. Because what happens is this, as you pointed to earlier, we are told, we're silenced using Islamophobia. We're told that, and I've written about this recently, and I'm very happy to share that article with you once it's published. It's in the process, on Muslim spaces and on how Islamophobia is used as a baton to suppress us and keep us silent, so that lest it enrages, or don't speak out too much. The far right will get hold of this, and it'll cause far more disturbance. But those people who are using that excuse never once say to the numerous scholars in our community, imams, religious scholars, educationists who on record have abused women. Nobody says that those men are the ones corrupting the image of our beautiful faith. No one cares, because this is why. Because according to their rationale, they expect men to behave that way. Right? They expect men. They don't expect them to sit like you, for us. They don't expect them to speak to other women and men as equal human beings. That's not how it's supposed to work. And they don't expect women to be in positions of authority. Right? They do not expect, no matter how educated we are, right? And even if I will be honest with you, I didn't share this earlier. I used to wear a headscarf. For half my life, I wore a headscarf. I wore a headscarf from soon after 9/11. Like I said, I was only a child, but I was expressing my identity, right? And then when I was 19, I decided to remove it for personal reasons. And I respect the choice of women, whether they choose to wear it or not wear it. And I am totally and completely against the enforcement and the policing of women's bodies, whether that's places like France, where they are told to remove and strip themselves, or in Iran, where they are told that they have to cover themselves. I do not think either is permissible, because underlying all of this is this dominance of the patriarchy. And that's what we need to be addressing. And that's a really important way to address these challenges, is by realizing that underpinning all of this is this power grabbing. It is about reinstating these binaries so that people will work accordingly, so that men will always continue to flourish and be on top and be unquestioned, and women will always be subdued and submissive. So, I think I've said a lot there, but I think that's one of the reasons, because we have accepted that marital rape is okay. We don't even, in many Muslim majority countries, when it comes to laws about rape, even that is, when we talk about zina, what does it even mean? We still consider, we don't call it, it's almost akin to fornication, basically. It's fornication almost without consent, but that's not, still we need a word, we need the right language and the tools and techniques to really address these issues. So the challenges are multi-pronged, but we need to really, again, sit together, find other, this is why your work is incredible, because you are speaking to so many people across the world with their unique and diverse range of experience. And I think finally, I will say this to round off this answer: in order to change these perceptions and to really influence people, it is going to be done when each of us plays a part. And not everyone has to have the same role, right? Not everyone has to be an academic or an educationist or a policymaker. But like I said about it being beginning in the home, that are, people often say, oh, well, housewives or women who are homemakers, that's the correct term, as opposed to a housewife, because it implies that she belongs to her husband or something. And that's the only reason she's home. She's chosen to be at home. She's chosen to make a home for her family. She has just as much input in, in tackling these social challenges as you and I do. So it is about empowering one another, standing for one another and holding space in these places so that each of us gets to speak and work towards a common goal.
Absolutely. And you have said it very articulately. So if I understood it, that it is absolutely okay for a woman to say that I stand my ground. If you don't have the consent, I will not take part in it. Connected to this question, what is your take on these three things? When a young Muslim woman does not want to get married, but then she's shamed, she's sent through perpetual emotional abuse, that your body clock is ticking. When are you going to give birth to a child? So for a Muslim woman, how she will exert clearly that it is my choice when I want to get married. Second, it is my choice whether I'll bear a child or not. If I don't have a child, it is my choice if I get pregnant, whether I will continue the pregnancy or not. So 3 questions: marriage, children, abortion.
Absolutely. Thank you for asking this question. And my answer to all 3 is not simply education, right? Education is great. It is, absolute requirement that we all educate ourselves. If formally in institutions, I would recommend that, we, that's why I'm a champion of women's education across the world. Young girls need to be educated, not just till high school, but, in degree level, they need to. But alongside this, the biggest way in which we can challenge this and ensure that these women are safeguarded from this what I would call bullying. It is cultural bullying. It is not just subjugation, but literally everyone will be asking and torturing her, if not forcing her. Sometimes we say, well, it's not really forced because nobody's doing anything to her, but the emotional hurt and trauma that she is experiencing from the age of her late teens till, well into her 20s and 30s, this is something we need to dismantle. Education is one way, but that education is no use if it does not, well, it is still useful, but in order to really harness its full capacity, it must lead to the financial emancipation of these women. Whether we like it or not, we live in a capitalistic hegemony, right? That is just how our world is. It is transactional when it comes to these dealings and affairs. So the biggest step, because mindsets, we can't sit here and say we need to change the mindsets of all our elders and all our younger generation. Granted, you and I will be working on that. Other people will be working on that too. We need to get the conversations going. But what about those women who are sitting in the middle of all of this, who are being berated and barraged with so many abusive taunts and slurs? As you said, that the biological clock is ticking rather. Mm-hmm. Yeah, these sort of things are happening. What do we do for them? We encourage them to become financially independent. I don't care how much you are earning as long as you are there, because that gives you that confidence. It enables you to go out into the world, face your biggest fears, right? And to become thick-skinned, that you are not fearful of anything but God. That is it. So once you have that, your life has, a different layer to it, something that a lot of women unfortunately haven't experienced. And that doesn't mean going out and having an office job. A lot of women, are very versatile. They might be entrepreneurs. They might be working from home. And we have plenty of examples across Islamic history of that, right? Some of them might be teachers. Some of them, do something that inspires you, right? And if you can monetize that, then more power to you. And a good way to do that, I would recommend, is even reaching out to people who you find inspiring, people who you consider mentors, and speaking to them. And, 90% of the time, I'm sure they'll be more than willing to speak to you or put you in touch with someone who might be helpful. That's how we support one another. And that's what keeps the sisterhood growing, right? I would be very happy if young girls would want to speak to me. I run a co-convene with other sisters, this global network of sisters in academia for Muslim women who are either embarking on a PhD or wanting to. And we have sisters from across the world. We have sisters in Malaysia, in Nigeria, just getting together in this safe space that we have created, because for us, this is what we can do. And I encourage other people in different professions to do the same, to make them more accessible to young Muslim women and women of faith. So that's how we do it. I think the biggest way is financial. It's education and religious literacy. Of course, we know our rights from our religion and also from secular society. But at the same time, acting out these or implementing these things in reality requires us to be independent of our thought and also in our financial affairs.
Absolutely. So you talked about just right now PhD, and this is something you have completed your PhD. I'm a PhD student, and I'm thinking I think last year I saw a tweet that in Toronto that took the Twitter in by storm, is that PhD student at University of Toronto, a Black woman, she tweeted that if any Black woman is applying for her PhD, please reach out to me. I'll help you write a statement of purpose. I'll help you, to go through the admission process. I know incredibly brilliant people in Bangladesh. And I was having a very open conversation with a friend of mine. I was telling my friend that you are more than qualified. You are more than doubly qualified. PhD application is just like, I'm sorry, you are a professor and I'm a student. I'm saying this is that, it's a stupid game. You have to learn how to play in a certain way. You have to know. I came to PhD, after almost 20 years of my teaching career. Mm-hmm. And I seen that how the schooling system crushes the spirit.
Oh yeah.
Imagine, my parents are, they live in the same village where they're born. They haven't gone to school and college. They don't know how to read and write. So the thing is, how do young women who come from similar kind of background, whose father is a farmer, whose mother is a homemaker, they don't have the cultural capital, the social capital. You mentioned that your mother is a doctor, your brother is a doctor, I'm not, maybe your father is also in health profession.
Yeah.
So from childhood, imagine the amount of cultural capital that you have had. I mean, when you write an essay, your brother is there to see it, your mother is there to see it. And therefore, and so this is a stupid game. So you have to know how to play it. So I don't think a lot of academics, professors, they say it very explicitly, is that it's just one language. So and a friend of mine asked a very, very important question, and something sensitive too, is that we don't have a woman imam. I mean, you can say is that, we have this kind of idea that a husband can, and a lot of apologists will say, oh, it's a symbolic, can symbolically hit his wife, to discipline. When it comes to wealth distribution, inheritance, it's 2:1. When it comes to witness, it's like how many two women's witness equals to one man's witness, right?
Yeah.
So these are incredibly sensitive questions, but I think if we pretend they don't exist, I don't think we're doing a good job to asking critical questions. So I will come back to the question, but you just mentioned moments ago about the academic training. The reason why we do this conversation, because in Bangladesh, we have identified, also in Canada, around the world, you learn literacy, the mechanical ways of reading and writing, but the space that allows and fosters critical thinking is painfully missing.
Yeah.
What good is the learning of a farmer's daughter in remote Bangladesh if she does not get equipped to think critically? So sorry, I just wanted to add that to you.
A great question. Sorry, continue and I'll answer.
So the question is, how do we address these issues? There's no woman imam, wealth distribution, when it comes to weakness, the symbolic right given to a husband to hit his wife to discipline.
Okay. I will address those momentarily, but I want to go back to a point that you mentioned, which is really, really important. And it's something we haven't covered just yet. Privilege, right?
Yeah.
This idea of privileged positions. And I think more and more people are beginning to acknowledge their privilege. So I myself I have acknowledged my privilege, but also doing something about it. So what am I doing with that? I'm not just going to sit here and say, oh yeah, so I have, mashallah, the best education in the world, went to the best schools in this country. Granted, they were on a scholarship, but I know that as a result of the cultural capital, as you said. But I think what makes it different is the fact that I acknowledge my roots. So I'm going to be very open here and say that both my parents are from villages, right? So for them to have, they were really, really intelligent. They still are. But when they met at medical school in Pakistan, and it was a wonderful, wonderful love story that they have, right? But before they got there, they came from still well-to-do families, but there's this rural or urban divide that must be overcome. There's a lot of stigma attached to them. So I'm very cognizant of that. I'm cognizant that in my current reality, there are going to be people, whether they're colleagues or even people who I mentor, who do not have the privileges that I have been afforded growing up. Hence why I believe immensely in payback, paying it forward, rather, that we pay what we can in different ways, not just monetarily, but the advice that I can give someone. So we often, through NISA, the Network of Sisters in Academia, which anyone who's listening and is a young woman, Muslim, who would like to join, just get in touch afterwards. We can definitely put you in the groups. We have a safe space so we can ask these questions to one another. Often there will be young women who are pursuing a PhD in different parts of the world, and they want to seek a mentor, and we will happily try our best to connect them with somebody who is an expert in the field, because that is our duty. It's our duty to pay back and give to our community to encourage more women to become academics, or at least gain that education. And also for many women who want to study for a PhD, it doesn't mean that they will end up in teaching positions. There are many different opportunities outside in industry, but often they don't know how to bridge that gap or how to make it out there. And we're more than happy to help one another to reach those aims. Now, the questions that you posed are really, really important questions about, the second part, about these rulings that we have, or interpretations that we have, or certain things are quite clear. So whether it's inheritance, or it is about the witnesses. Okay, when I was younger, I would think about this a lot. Or even my mum says, when I was younger, she says about herself, she goes, I would think about these issues. You would keep me up at night. She comes from a family, her father and her parents are very learned in the faith. They come from a line of distinguished imams and mullahs, and people who spent their whole life hafiz al-Quran, learning it off by heart. This is traditional in their family. And so obviously she's exposed to this at a young age. And, I'm grateful that I'm able to have these conversations with her. And I think one thing that comes to mind is when you sit and question and reflect, you need to understand the purpose of these, edicts, or what we have as conventional or mainstream interpretations, right? And I'm not here to suggest, one thing that I should make clear is I'm not suggesting people need to reform the faith. I personally do not think that using terms like that is conducive. I think what we should be doing is reforming our mindsets, or recalibrating our expectations, because the faith is there. Everyone's already interpreting it, right? There are people who interpret it differently. Saying reform almost implies that, that we're changing the faith, which is not what we're doing. Ijtihad certainly exists, right? And I'm very cautious of the language that we use, specifically because of the issues that it has caused in the past. So things like the witness, right? If we unpack that and understand the reasoning behind, this idea that 2 women instead of 1, it's not because women are deficient. It's because in that time period, women needed someone to support them in the way, because it was, in that patriarchal society when women didn't really engage, it really helped. It wasn't like a necessary, women are more than capable of giving their evidence. But imagine the situations that they're in where there's hostility towards them as a witness, providing evidence. What helped some of them was that there was someone there to support them who was also a woman. So that, the sisterhood is so strong that she feels empowered to speak her truth. That is my personal understanding of it through the research that I have done. But again, I do feel very privileged to belong to a line of women who have fought long and hard against these rulings, because we know these rulings have been misinterpreted in a way to subjugate women. So under Zia-ul-Haq, in the 1980s in Pakistan, a lot of women who paved the way forward for today's feminists in Pakistan, they championed this cause of women's rights, right? Specifically these issues, women's inheritance as well. Now, with regards to inheritance, we try and understand the wisdom behind it. I personally do, I don't have the answers to everything, and I don't think anyone does. But it's okay to admit that you do not have the answers. And then, not just saying, oh, leave it to God, but just kind of constantly question. So I'm in the process of trying to understand that. I speak to my father and other learned scholars about this, that why is it this way? But in cases where, we don't have the answers, we do know that if something is suggested, it doesn't mean that we have to follow that rule. So in Muslim majority countries, there is absolutely room for people to change that, in the inheritance documents. It's not like, if you go against it, it's haram. I know so many families who have done that, where they have given their sons an equal share to their daughters, because in their lives, their contexts, they're different, right? And I think that's beautiful. And I think ijtihad is a wonderful thing. Point about the imams, women imams, right? This is a very deeply contested issue amongst a lot of Muslims, both traditional and liberal in mindset. And I am someone who is positioned in all of this as somebody who trains faith leaders, right? So my day job is that I lecture on this Master's in Public Administration in Faith-Based Leadership at the University of Birmingham. So if anyone would like to find out more information about that again or enroll in it, we take a very worldview. So we have a global approach to this. We have candidates from across the world. And what we basically do is we train them, we equip them with the knowledge and skill set. So it's not just, having religious knowledge, right? Because you cannot impart your wisdom if you do not know the context that you're working in. Your knowledge is of no use if you don't know the people who you're engaging with or the challenges they face. So that's what we do. We help them, encourage them in terms of financial literacy as well, pastoral care, organizational management, etc. And what I have found through this, the meaning of a faith leader, right? It's much more than congregational prayer. And I feel, unfortunately, within Muslim spaces or even externally, we've put a lot of emphasis on the role of an imam. And I do not think this is conducive because we, as our faith, it doesn't have this hierarchy. And I'm completely against this hierarchy of, what the imam says goes, because that is kind of like priesthood. I'm not a fan of designating that role to an imam or a qari or somebody saying that, this person is the go-to person, because, again, I'm very wary of abuses of power, specifically spiritual abuses, happening in this midst because we have given them that status. Instead, when I talk about a faith leader, I talk about people who are, yes, leading in prayer, but also leading their congregation in much more. So many of the faith leaders who are Muslim women are heads of charities. Charitable causes are huge. Heads of board members of their local governing societies, schools, communities, where things really matter. They are just as much as a faith leader as somebody who teaches Quran, right? But yes, I understand that some people, the reason why I said it was contested, because I know, especially within pockets of the diaspora, the idea that, firstly, I should say they are women imams. They very much are. They may not be accepted by wider society, but there are very many of them growing in number in inclusive spaces, right? And that's their choice. And I respect that immensely. And I think they should have that choice because plurality is what we should be fostering. That said, I do understand that there are going to be people who are more conservatively minded, right? Who might not agree with it, or maybe they haven't been brought up with this idea that women should be leading prayer, not because women are deficient, but it's just something that doesn't sit right with them. Now, instead of stigmatizing them and saying that they're wrong and that they have to become more liberal, that's not the way we should be going. Instead, what we should be doing is, encouraging people to express themselves in a multitude of ways, as long as they are not harming anyone else. So if a conservative-minded group of people says to me, and we have that across different faiths, they're more Orthodox and liberal Jews and Christians, choice matters, and respecting that choice is absolutely imperative, right? It is a choice of a conservative person or conservatively minded person to say, actually, you know what? As a Muslim woman, I prefer segregated prayer because it means that I can take my hijab off and I can sit there quietly and not have men around. And you know what? I respect that. As somebody who doesn't wear hijab, I still respect her choice, right? And her culture and her understanding. And it's my duty to respect that. And it's also my duty to respect a woman who says she wants to lead prayer because that is her interpretation. It's not about me having to follow a conservative or liberal approach, but that any approach that I take is premised on social justice and adab, an etiquette of respecting that choice. So that's basically how I would address it. That, it's not about forcing, because we cannot force or coerce people to be more open-minded or more conservative. And I think that's where we're going wrong in many faith communities, that we're trying to push and pull people in different directions. Instead, what we should be doing is people like you and I need to be fostering that harmony across these divides.
And what is your take on the fact that a husband can symbolically hit
Yeah, I mean, that has been abused so much. Like, that is, we see that everywhere. Like, I was reading the other day that I think about 95% of cases of 95% of women in Pakistani households have suffered domestic abuse, and reported cases are far less than the actual number of cases that exist, right? And the reason why that happens is because people have used religion to justify their actions. There's no question about it. So I think ijtihad is really, really necessary. Not just ijtihad. I'll give you an example. There's two ways to go about this, okay? Firstly, it is about imams and community leaders and religious leaders in the Muslim community and spaces to actively condemn this violence, right? So I have really good friends who are former trainees on my training courses, etc., who are heads of different sects of our community. So I have a wonderful friend who, Sheikh Nuru, who is a Ghanaian origin imam in the Shia community of Birmingham. He basically is in charge of the Shia mosques in that region. And I was fortunate enough to have a conversation with him. We have it recorded, and inshallah I will share it with you, specifically about this issue. And he's basically said that it is up to people like him to stand up firmly and say that this is not appropriate, that we will not tolerate this violence, and you cannot justify it by saying that she deserved it, or look, it says it here. Because similarly, those very people also justify slavery using the Quran. Right? So we cannot stand by and let people continue to abuse, right? Because for a long period of time, even cutting off the hands of people who were stealing or thieves was appropriate. But then there was, it was instituted that this has gone beyond our means, that so many people are going to be left there without hands. Like, our faith is a beautiful thing, and it is premised on common sense and the realities of our lives. So let's not complicate these things. So when issues arise of this nature, then, fatwas are issued to make things easier for us, not to worsen things. So we need to focus on bringing those voices to the fore. Secondly, change is really implemented through legal processes, right? And I'll give you a wonderful example. I have friends who are campaigners in the Jewish community in Britain. And recently we had a domestic abuse bill. And for the first time in history in Britain, domestic abuse incorporates coercive control in faith communities, so that Jewish men who refuse their wives the Jewish divorce, which is known as a get, if they refuse that for any reason, that is an act of domestic abuse. So they can be criminally prosecuted on that basis, instead of, saying that before the victim would have to use other criminal processes and procedures to say that this has happened. And I think this is a huge step, not just about engaging community members, but actually the law of the land is now saying that this is a protection in order. Now, what I hope to do, and what other campaigners hope to do, is to extrapolate that, to extend that, so our sisters in the Muslim community can also avail of this protection. So again, your approach needs to really not just be all talk and no action. We need actual protections in the law.
Speaking of divorce, something that we must talk about.
Yeah.
So in Muslim communities, have you heard narratives like this? Oh, divorce is permissible, but it is the most hated act of God. And hence, you're not, because obviously, the best of the, Muslims, and even, people who are included in the Ashara Mubashara, they also had divorces. So, yeah. So in terms of understanding divorce, is that the idea that it's possible for two people being perfectly two wonderful human beings may not be able to get along together, and hence peacefully, respectfully parting their ways, is not a concept from Islam. It's an idea we have imported from the West. The West has infiltrated our Muslim communities and faiths. So When two people profoundly incompatible, I often say this, and I don't know if you are a fan of South Asian movies, the idea of falling in love with one person and hence happily ever after and all of that, is that we are burdening our young generation, our children, to this mythical romantic relationship that does not exist. But then when they come together, a dysfunctional relationship is asked to be continued even at the expense of their well-being. This is God's most disliked task. How do we openly and candidly talk about divorce, normalize the fact that divorce can happen?
It's a great question.
How do we approach it? Please.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So I think the best way to do this, to normalize instead of stigmatizing and demonizing divorced Muslims, is first and foremost, as I said earlier, education, financial literacy, so that they can embark on this without fearing what people say. That's just at the individual level, what people can do when they're in those situations. But societally speaking, I think you raise a wonderful point that actually the most, most loved and beloved women in Islamic history, the foremothers of our Muslims today, they were divorced or widowed and remarried several times. It was not a taboo. Okay, over time, it has become more of a taboo, and which, on the one hand, I always say, if I have time, one day I will probably write something on a book on an advice for dating Muslims and relationships with Muslims, because obviously some people misconstrue what dating means. But it's simply because, firstly, there's this joke that you need to be, you can't date before marriage, and then all of a sudden you're expected to marry a complete stranger, almost. Even if you've chosen them or you've consented to it, there's not so much you know about that person. So of course, many cases, I think, I can't remember, was it 1 in 3 Western Muslims or Muslims across the world end up in divorce? Like, it is very common for our communities, and it's something that, even though that is so common, there is this sort of struggle to not just accept it, but even to acknowledge that it exists. That people who are, doing well in other aspects of their lives, somehow, if they, choose not to be violated or choose not to continue in, as you said, an incompatible situation, like, at the end of the day, if we are to be completely literal about our faith, it is a contract between two people, okay? Two consenting adults. And if they choose to no longer embark on it, it is up to them. But what actually happens is that people in our communities, in our cultures, oftentimes not only prevent that from happening, in some cases, when there is a compatible couple, others will try their very best out of jealousy and spite to break them apart. Now, what people don't realize is that, when we talk about what God hates most, what God actually hates most is those who get in between a couple, right? And that's something that people don't talk about if they were to actually analyze the texts of our faith. But that is probably the most impermissible of actions, right? Because you're messing with the lives of innocent people and you're destroying homes. And that happens, unfortunately. Now, coming back to normalizing those who consent to be free and choose not to live, amicably, if they choose to divorce, they should be free to do so. And I think one way of normalizing it, as you mentioned earlier, was media, right? You mentioned the movies. I think, and I see this happening more so, is that we need role models in these characters that we see who have had these situations in their lives and they've grown as a result. We need better character building in the fictional sense, right? We need to see these men and women who are living their lives. I mean, and not just through media. I think it is really important, also having role models in reality who are not fitting that mold, not ticking those boxes, not a mother of 3 children by the age they're 30, because the majority of young Muslims, millennials and Generation Z, do not fit that cookie cutter, picture perfect vision that we have created in our minds, as you said, which has really detrimented our understanding of healthy relationships. So I think a lot needs to be done, but one way of normalizing it through portrayals in media. And also, I would really encourage those who are divorced and working in this field to speak out, to talk about their experiences. And I think that would be really, really enriching, because they can set the precedent and say, look, there is no stigma. And this is who I am. I am a perfectly decent Muslim person who, for whatever reason, is either, and it doesn't matter, and it shouldn't matter. And that, that will hopefully encourage more people to not suffer in silence and not stay in unloving and unfulfilled situations, which aren't relationships. They're just literally situations where you're sharing a life with someone who doesn't respect you or you can't tolerate, simply because you're told you have to, otherwise God will hate you. People need to take a step back, I think, sometimes, and realize, is this really my faith, or is this what people tell me I should be doing in order to keep me subjugated?
I once read a text where, it's a wonderful text in a hadith that says that Sahaba woman came to Prophet ﷺ and said that, my husband has not done anything wrong to me. Mm-hmm. He's kind, he's responsible. It's just the fact that I don't feel attracted to him.
Good.
Plain and simple. And Prophet ﷺ said, okay, then you can divorce him. And this is the text from, so the question is, the way we make divorce taboo, and here is also in terms of, you said that normalizing people who are divorced, it also comes to the point of understanding privileges. Like parents, I come from a very remote village. I'm the first in my family, first of the 11 siblings to attend university. So if I think about my sisters, if I think about members of my family, me having, the privileges of living in a let's say, relatively well-off space, living in an academic space, it's easier for somebody like me to have that cultural capital to maneuver through social spaces. But if my sister wants to navigate that same kind of social reality in the village, it's going to be, I know women who have been divorced for a long time would not talk about it, because they don't want their children to, the women don't get invited to other people's house because this is a divorcee woman who can potentially steal my husband, and so on and so forth. So I think it's incredibly important to talk about these things, bluntly and openly. I have so many other questions. I'll ask one last question, and then I don't know if you are pushed for time. One other thing that, I must mention, that these conversations will be watched and rewatched by people. And when you just mentioned that, young Muslim women can reach out to you for connection, I will tell you that a lot of women will reach out to you, at least from Bangladesh.
I'm so happy and honored to have that connection with them, because they are the future. We are the future. So happily, I will send you, if there's any way, maybe towards the end, I will list off the social medias that I'm on. And also I will give the email address that they can reach me on.
And that would be wonderful. And then I will share them, as widely as possible to, Muslim women, and also women of other faith. I'm sorry, when I say Muslim women, I don't mean only Muslim women. You have been, as I respect your accomplishments, and you are a strong role model, and you're also an interfaith leader. You talk with people from other faith groups. Now, in a pluralistic society, democratic society, when we're getting to understand that to what extent the LGBTQ communities have been marginalized politically, socially, culturally, in Muslim communities, we struggled really bad, in my humble opinion, to actually wrap our head around it.
Yeah.
How would you take it head on to understand different sexual orientations, and what can we do?
Excellent question. It is something that we are grappling with. So I think it's very important to address this, because we all have intersectional identities, as we mentioned earlier, right? We cannot deny the existence of Muslims who are also LGBT, right? Many of our friends are either openly or living in the closet who are Muslim. right? And when I say we, I mean the mainstream cisgender, majoritarian Muslim, so somebody who is of a Sunni background or a non-denominational person. We have it easy in that respect in our internal spaces because we feel like we have a monopoly over the faith. That we can denounce someone as non-Muslim simply for their gender or their sect or their orientation. And sadly, many Muslims in our own spaces, regardless of the part of the world that they're in, they are targeted, right? As earlier we were talking about stigmas afflicted upon divorced people. Similarly, they're targeted for their sect or their sex or their orientation. So I think these sort of things in a pluralistic system and organizing the way we do, we must address it. So we need to unlearn and re-educate ourselves about the rights and inherent in the teachings of our faith, right? Our faith does not tell us, it does not prescribe that we should, astaghfirullah, we should stigmatize or, in some cases, people murder someone they think is LGBT. Even recently, last few days, we had a case of a young man in Iran who was beheaded by his own brothers simply because he was a member of the LGBT community. I believe he was gay. He wasn't open. He was planning to escape because, his life had become unbearable. And I understand there are certain interpretations of the story of Hazrat Lut. So, people will obviously, they immediately they say, well, we have this precedent, and we can't continue like this. We can't celebrate gay or lesbian people. And I just kind of think, actually, that's, you have your interpretation, but nowhere does your interpretation seek to vilify and glorify the murder of LGBT people, does it? Why do you jump from, oh, it's not permissible to, we should just, we should get rid of them? That sort of thinking is it's deadly. It is actually really, it's actually scary because, every Muslim on this earth will agree that our faith is for the purpose of betterment of society, of valuing human life, right? Over everything. It is about cherishing our siblings in faith and humanity. So for someone to then stand up and say, well, actually we can't do that because this is why, and then kind of give their interpretation of it, you know what? I find that really, really, I think it says more about the person who is purporting those ideas than it does about the people on the receiving end. And I think, obviously, because a lot of people are conservatively minded, and many people are liberally minded, I think in order to address issues like this, it is important to have those conservatively minded people on board, right? We need to address this issue of hatred towards LGBT Muslims through our communities. And it's not just about inclusive spaces, right? It's wonderful that we have those. I really, really commend people who are making mosque spaces more inclusive, not only to LGBT people, but also people with less abled people. So having, like the azan in sign language or something, I think these are wonderful steps. But actually addressing this issue, whether you are in the East or the West, in Muslim spaces, we need to really work together. And I don't mean, by shunning one group of people in favor of another, because the majority of Muslims globally are still conservatively minded, they're still orthodox. But I think that's where we need to make the change, in that we encourage and facilitate these conversations so that people who are gay, so I was speaking to friends actually who are orthodox in their nature, and he happens to be a male Muslim in London, and he's of same ethnic heritage as me, South Asian. And we were having this conversation, and I was really politely and pleasantly surprised when he said, actually, if my children happened to be gay, I'd be very accepting of them. And I think change is happening. And I was like, okay, how do you say this? And he said, well, look, think about it this way. Would I rather stigmatize my child so that he is no longer part of a community just because I'm against or I'm told I need to be against some element of his identity, right? Some people are murderers. We still accept them in our family. So why should I, when it comes to families, often they cut ties with children. And I thought that was really refreshing. And I similarly, I feel like, many of us, when we pray together, if we can pray together and be together in our communities with our LGBT siblings, then surely we should extend that empathy, and we should work towards fostering Muslim spaces that are indeed free from fear and from exclusion and hatred. Because I think that is our job. I'm not suggesting that conservative people need to start championing LGBT as a way of life. I know they're not going to do that, so why would I suggest it? But what I can suggest is bringing people together, because I see that is like the essence of anything that we've spoken about today. And I'll leave it at that we need to really work together to create a system whereby we all feel accepted in who we are. Not when I mean accepted, I don't think that people are going to celebrate other people's way of life. We do that externally, don't we? When we do interfaith work for us, we extend that hand of friendship. We don't necessarily agree, and we do not try to rid those differences, but we respect them. I think that's what we need to be doing internally in Muslim spaces.
So it's possible for me, for a person to be lesbian and a Muslim, practicing Muslim.
It happens.
It's possible. And when we say that, we need to work with them, does it mean that our intervention needs to be in a way to, and I'm going to use this word very deliberately and advisedly, is that cure them from their sickness of being, I am not going to name that, very celebrated, Shaikh, a very big Islamic scholar, his interpretation of these communities that, well, if you have proclivity to have association with people of your same gender, then thinking about God, don't, and God is going to reward you for that. So I find it fundamentally problematic, is that understanding somebody needs to be apologetic for who they are. I mean, I'm a cisgendered male. I don't know what does it mean to live with that, the constant pretension that, so I say these things from a long training in sociology, but also, trying to understand what does it mean to live in young people commit suicide.
Exactly.
Because they think what I have in the proclivity in me is wrong, and hence I should die.
Yeah. No, I don't think that's the appropriate approach. I know, as you already said, there are some sheikhs who suggest that is the way of going about it, but I'm not here to debate what they believe or what they stand for, because again, they're trying to use their piety, their overt piety, as a way of saying that, their opinion is stronger and therefore we should follow their way. I'm not here to even debate semantics or faith. I'm simply, as you just rightly said, if people are committing suicide on the basis of something that you preach, certainly it is time for us to reevaluate what it is that you are teaching and preaching, and trying to force convert people. And it happens across the different faiths. This is not going to end well. It never does. And I have close friends who are told that they need to do this, and I'm strongly against the idea of forcing someone to unlearn something that they, they're born with. Like, I don't know. I just think that some people are so attached to being right, or their way of life being the correct way, that instead of taking a step back and saying, I might not have all the answers, but that doesn't make me less of a Muslim or a Jew or a Christian, I think humility is missing. Right?
Absolutely.
And that's where we're going wrong. And I think, no, of course, we shouldn't be force converting anyone. We should be creating spaces so that people feel more comfortable. And there's, like with heterosexual relationships and the private-public divide, I think, we're not here to say that, that vulgarity needs to be promoted, even if it's a same-sex relationship. Of course, there is decorum. There is going to be some sort of etiquette, right? But that doesn't mean draconian enforcement of etiquette, that we all have to, even today, like you and I can't speak because we have to lower our gaze. And if we're speaking as human beings, as equals, on par, respecting one another, then to hell with everything else, with these nonsensical sort of, tiptoeing around these enforcements. For what? For whose benefit? So I think we really need to understand everything that we do. We need to contextualize it, and that I don't know why people insist on pursuing this line of thinking that, think about our universe, think about where we fit in this magnificent, vast universe that we have, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created, right? We're a speck on that universe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We have the power to transform the lives of other people for the greater good.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Let's focus on that. Let's focus on
Yeah.
working together, regardless of whether somebody is gay or straight or asexual or divorced or married or single. Let's focus on what we can all achieve. Let's harness each other's power together. So that's my message.
Yeah. I'm sorry I said that, that was the last question, but, I prolonged it anyway.
Okay.
What would be, to end the conversation, Dr. Mehmood, what would be your message to young Bangladeshi girls and women, Muslim majority country, a lot of them, young girls and women, who constantly feel the pressure to abide by the religious misinterpreted edicts that if you don't have a guardian, you cannot go from A to B. You need somebody to liberate you, so on and so forth. You teach people, you train interfaith leaders. What would be your message to Bangladeshi young Muslim girls and women?
I think my message is quite strong throughout. So I always talk about education. I always talk about self-empowerment. Nobody's going to give you agency. Nobody's going to give you that power. You have that within you, right? Your job is to unleash it, to really harness its full potential. And how do you do that? You do that by working together. No woman is an island, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And some of us have privileges, some of us have setbacks, but we work together. And that's the only way we can eradicate these abuses. And this won't be easy. It means sacrificing a great deal. It might mean certain things that you had planned in your life that you thought were dear to you, you might not achieve those. But what you do achieve, ultimately, is what God has planned for you. And that will be even more fruitful than you can even ever imagine, something beyond your wildest dreams. So may you have faith, and may that guide you to being fearless in the face of naysayers, whether that's society or family, and the systems of oppression that you face. May you stand tall and firm and united in your sisterhood. I think that is my message. And just quickly, I think just for people who want to follow on social media, you can follow me on Facebook. It's through my full name. You can reach me on Twitter. So my handle on Twitter is, you can find me from my name, obviously. I don't think many people spell it like I do, but it's and then Maryyum Mehmood. It's basically the first half of my full name and the second half, so Maryyum. And you can go on to www.theshiftwithmaryyum.com. You can find at The Shift with Maryyum, just Shift with Maryyum on Instagram. Again, if you type my name into these search bars, you will find it. I'm also on YouTube. Please follow my YouTube content. I think that's about it for now. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mehmood. I can tell you this, I have, I received, and as you can see, there are questions that are coming, and there are questions that, came. I could not, ask all of those questions, and then certainly, these questions, these conversations will be heard and reheard. I will reach out to you, and I was wondering that if you could work together, Shift and Canada Bangladesh Social Justice Actionist Alliance, to have dialogues about things that I don't think we could possibly cover in one discussion. Absolutely, but you have given us very generously a time from your busy schedule. Thank you very much, and once again, we are very grateful to our audience, who have been with us, and asked very rich questions. And have a wonderful day. And once again, Eid Mubarak.
Khair Mubarak, thank you for including me, and I am grateful for the wonderful opportunities that this will carve out, not only for the Shift, but for the Social Justice Action Research Alliance, and for the many people whose lives that we can help towards betterment, inshallah.
Yeah, thank you.